What's up, folks? I'm Dan, and welcome to I've Been Meaning to Read That, the show where I read books out loud that I've been meaning to read. Let's go. I am a big believer in the statement that if you can't laugh, you gotta cry. So I do my best to laugh at things that I would consider to be pretty awful that happened to me, because I prefer that over just crying about it. Not that if that's your choice, I look down on you at all. That's all to say that this week I had some pretty horrible things happen to me in the classroom, and I decided that I'd just tell you guys about it. So last Wednesday, I was with the kids out on the field at recess, and two delinquents, less than high school age probably, were cruising around the field where we do recess on a dirt bike and insulting everybody, F you and F that, and, all that jazz. Smoking cigarettes on the bike, which seems difficult, so I'll give them that. It's impressive. And when I waved them to get off the field and said, hey, you guys got to leave or I'm going to call the cops, they flipped me off, did another lap, and then rode straight at me and moved when they were about 6 feet away from me. And I could have moved out of the way, but part of me was like, well, they'll just adjust, so they're continuing to just go straight at me. And then the other part of me thought, they don't want to run me over, they don't want to catch a charge or anything. But I didn't know that, and they just ran straight at me. And, at the last second, 6 feet away or so, they out of the way, and I was fine. And I'm on the phone with the cops as it's happening. And about 10 minutes later, I was inside the school giving an update, a briefing to my principal, and I realized I almost just got run over today. That's a pretty bad day. Very rarely have people ever tried to run me over. Even when I rode my bike to work, people weren't trying to run me over. It just accidentally happened a couple times that they almost did. So after that occurrence, we go about the rest of our day. I probably could have taken the rest of the day off and nobody would have faulted me, but like I said, I didn't even think about it. It was too shocking to even register. Later that day, kids were being just ornery because, again, they had almost seen their teacher hit by a motorcycle. And at the very end of the day, my last class, I had one kid bullying a girl so bad that she kept trying to fight him, and I had to send him out of the room. Then another girl cut her partner's hair while they were doing a project. The girl whose hair got cut did not ask for this haircut. So she stormed out of the room, and then I had to send the barber, as I am now calling her, out of the room. And then there was a kid who had a big piece of cardboard, and he pretended to hit the IEP special ed teacher with it. And I said, hey, don't even pretend. And I looked away for about a second, and I looked back, and he was hitting the teacher with a piece of cardboard. And when I told him that he needed to go to the office, he got very, very pissy with me. What do you mean? What? Tell me what's wrong with what I did. It's just cardboard. Come on, man. Just a lot of attitude. So I went home that evening. I went to bed at about 7 p.m., which is my usual go-to move on a bad day. Just go to sleep and start over tomorrow. It's a new day. So it was pretty bad. Hopefully, you guys find that in any way amusing. By the way, these students that I have are 7th graders, so they're absolutely old enough to know that you should not cut people's hair or hit teachers. Anyways, let's get on with the Count of Monte Cristo. Chapter 20, The Cemetery of the Chateau d'If. On the bed, at full length, and faintly illuminated by the pale light that came from the window, lay a sack of canvas, and under its rude folds was stretched a long and stiffened form. It was Faria's last winding sheet. A winding sheet which, as the turnkey said, cost so little. Everything was in readiness. A barrier had been placed between Dantes and his old friend. No longer could Edmund look into those wide-open eyes which had seemed to be penetrating the mysteries of death. No longer could he clasp the hand which had done so much to make his existence blessed. Faria, the beneficent and cheerful companion, with whom he was accustomed to live so intimately, no longer breathed. He seated himself on the edge of that terrible bed and fell into melancholy and gloomy reverie, alone. He was alone again condemned to silence, again face to face with nothingness, alone. Never again to see the face, never again to hear the voice of the only human being who united him to earth. Was not Faria's fate the better, after all, to solve the problem of life at its source, even at the risk of horrible suffering? The idea of suicide, which his friend had driven away and kept away by his cheerful presence, now hovered like a phantom over the abbé's dead body. "If I could die," he said, "I should go where he goes, and should assuredly find him again. But how to die? It's very easy," he went on with a smile. "I will remain here, rush on the first person that opens the door, strangle him, and then they'll guillotine me." But excessive grief is like a storm at sea, where the frail bark is tossed from the depths to the top of the waves. Dantes recoiled from the idea of so infamous a death, and passed suddenly from despair to an ardent desire for life and liberty. "Die? No," he exclaimed. "Not die now, after having lived and suffered so long and so much. Die? Yes, had I died years ago. But now to die would be, indeed, to give way to the sarcasm of destiny. No, I want to live. I shall struggle to the very last. I will yet win back the happiness of which I have been deprived. Before I die, I must not forget that I have my executioners to punish, and perhaps, too, who knows, some friends to reward. Yet they will forget me here. I shall die in my dungeon like Faria." As he said this, he became silent and gazed straight before him like one overwhelmed with a strange and amazing thought. Suddenly he arose, lifted his hand to his brow as if his brain were giddy, paced twice or thrice around the dungeon, and then paused abruptly by the bed. "Just God," he muttered. "Whence comes this thought? Is it from thee? Since none but the dead pass freely from this dungeon, let me take the place of the dead." Without giving himself time to reconsider his decision, and indeed, that he might not allow his thoughts to be distracted from his desperate resolution, he bent over the appalling shroud, opened it with the knife which Faria had made, drew the corpse from the sack, and bore it along the tunnel to his own chamber. He laid it on his couch, tied around its head the rag he wore at night, covered it with his counterpane, once again kissed the ice-cold brow, and tried vainly to close the resisting eyes, which glared horribly. He turned the head towards the wall so that the jailer might, when he brought the evening meal, believe that he was asleep, as was his frequent custom. He entered the tunnel again, drew the bed against the wall, and returned to the other cell. He took from the hiding place the needle and thread, flung off his rags, that they might feel only naked flesh beneath the coarse canvas, and getting inside the sack, placed himself in the posture in which the dead body had been laid, and sewed up the mouth of the sack from the inside. He would have been discovered by the beating of his heart, if by any mischance the jailers had entered at that moment. Dantes might have waited until the evening visit was over, but he was afraid that the governor would change his mind and order the dead body to be removed earlier. In that case, his last hope would have been destroyed. Now his plans were fully made, and this is what he intended to do. If, while he was being carried out, the grave diggers should discover that they were bearing a live instead of a dead body, Dantes did not intend to give them time to recognize him. But with a sudden cut of the knife, he meant to open the sack from top to bottom and, profiting by their alarm, escape. If they tried to catch him, he would use his knife to better purpose. If they took him to the cemetery and laid him in a grave, he would allow himself to be covered with earth, and then, as it was night, the grave diggers would scarcely have turned their backs before he would have worked his way through the yielding soil and escaped. He hoped that the weight of earth would not be so great that he could not overcome it. If he was detected in this, and the earth proved too heavy, he would be stifled, and then, so much the better, all would be over. Dantes had not eaten since the preceding evening, but he had not thought of hunger, nor did he think of it now. His situation was too precarious to allow him even time to reflect on any thought but one. The first risk that Dantes ran was that the jailer, when he brought him his supper at 7 o'clock, might perceive the change that had been made. Fortunately, 20 times at least, from misanthropy or fatigue, Dantes had received his jailer in bed, and then the man placed his bread and soup on the table and went away without saying a word. This time, the jailer might not be silent as usual, but speak to Dantes, and seeing that he received no reply, go to the bed and thus discover all. When 7 o'clock came, Dantes' agony really began. His hand placed upon his heart was unable to redress its throbbings, while, With the other, he wiped the perspiration from his temples. From time to time, chills ran through his whole body and clutched his heart in a grasp of ice. Then he thought he was going to die. Yet the hours passed on without any unusual disturbance, and Dantes knew that he had escaped the first peril. It was a good augury. At length, about the hour the governor had appointed, footsteps were heard on the stairs. Edmund felt that the moment had arrived, summoned up all his courage, held his breath, and would have been happy if at the same time he could have repressed the throbbing of his veins. The footsteps, they were double, paused at the door, and Dantes guessed that the two gravediggers had come to seek him. This idea was soon converted into certainty when he heard the noise they made in putting down the hand bier. The door opened, and a dim light reached Dante's eyes through the coarse sack that covered him. He saw two shadows approach his bed, a third remaining at the door with a torch in its hand. The two men, approaching the ends of the bed, took the sack by its extremities. "He's heavy, though, for an old and thin man," said one as he raised the head. "They say every year adds 1/2 pound to the weight of the bones," said another, lifting the feet. "Have you tied the knot?" inquired the first speaker. "What would be the use of carrying so much more weight?" asked the reply. "I can do that when we get there." "Yes, you're right," replied the companion. "What's the knot for?" thought Dantes. They deposited the supposed corpse on the bier. Edmund stiffened himself in order to play the part of a dead man, and then the party, lighted by the man with the torch who went first, ascended the stairs. Suddenly, he felt the fresh and sharp night air, and Dantes knew that the mistral wind was blowing. It was a sensation in which pleasure and pain were strangely mingled. The bearers went on for 20 paces, then stopped, putting the bier down on the ground. One of them went away, and Dantes heard his shoes striking on the pavement. "Where am I?" he asked himself. "Really, he is by no means a light load," said the other bearer, sitting on the edge of the hand barrow. Dante's first impulse was to escape, but fortunately he did not attempt it. "Give us a light," said the other bearer, "or I shall never find what I'm looking for." The man with the torch complied, although not asked in the most polite terms. "What can he be looking for?" thought Edmund. "The spade, perhaps?" An exclamation of satisfaction indicated that the gravedigger had found the object of his search. "Here it is at last," he said. "Not without some trouble, though." "Yes," was the answer, "but it has lost nothing by waiting." As he said this, the man came towards Edmund, who heard a heavy metallic substance laid down beside him, and at that same moment a cord was fastened round his feet with sudden and painful violence. "Well, have you tied the knot?" inquired the gravedigger, who was looking on. "Yes, and pretty tight, too, I can tell you," was the answer. "Move on, then," and the bier was lifted once more, and they proceeded. They advanced 50 paces farther, and then stopped to open a door, then went forward again. The noise of the waves dashing against the rocks on which the chateau is built reached Dante's ears distinctly as they went forward. "Bad weather," observed one of the bearers. "Not a pleasant night for a dip in the sea." "Why, yes, the abbé runs a chance of being wet," said the other, and then there was a burst of brutal laughter. Dantes did not comprehend the jest, but his hair stood erect on his head. "Well, here we are at last," said one of them. "A little farther, said the other. "You know very well that the last was stopped on his way, dashed on the rocks, and the governor told us next day that we were careless fellows." They ascended 5 or 6 more steps, and then Dantes felt that they took him, one by the head and the other by the heels, and swung him to and fro. 1, 2, 3, and at that same instant Dantes felt himself flung into the air like a wounded bird, falling with a rapidity that made his blood curdle. Although drawn downwards by the heavy weight which hastened his rapid descent, it seemed to him as if the fall lasted for a century. At last, with a horrible splash, he darted like an arrow into the ice-cold water, and as he did so he uttered a shrill cry, stifled in a moment by his immersion beneath the waves. Dantes had been flung into the sea and was dragged into its depths by a 36-pound shot tied to his feet. The sea is the cemetery of the Chateau d'If. Chapter 21. The Island of Tiboulen. Dantes, although stunned and almost suffocated, had sufficient presence of mind to hold his breath, and as his right hand, prepared as he was for every chance, held his knife open, he rapidly ripped up the sack, extricated his arm, and then his body. But in spite of all his efforts to free himself from the shot, he felt it dragging him down, still lower. He then bent his body, and by a desperate effort severed the cord that bound his legs, at the moment when it seemed as if he were actually strangled. With a mighty leap, he rose to the surface of the sea, while the shot dragged down to the depths the sack that had been so nearly his shroud. Dantes waited only to get breath, and then dived in order to avoid being seen. When he arose a second time, he was 50 paces from where he had first sunk. He saw overhead a black and tempestuous sky, across which the wind was driving clouds that occasionally suffered a twinkling star to appear. Before him was the vast expanse of waters, somber and terrible, whose waves foamed and roared as if before the approach of a storm. Behind him, blacker than the sea, blacker than the sky, rose, phantom-like, the vast stone structure whose projecting crags seemed like arms extended to seize their prey, and on the highest rock was a torch lighting 2 figures. He fancied that these 2 forms were looking at the sea. Doubtless these strange gravediggers had heard his cry. Dantes dived again, and remained a long time beneath the water. This was an easy feat to him, for he usually attracted a crowd of spectators in the bay before the lighthouse at Marseille when he swam there, and was unanimously declared to be the best swimmer in the port. When he came up again, the light had disappeared. He must now get his bearings. Ratonneau and Pommigue are the nearest islands of all those that surround the Chateau d'If, but Ratonneau and Pommigue are inhabited, as is also the islet of Daume. Teboulin and La Mer were therefore the safest for Dantes' venture. The islands of Teboulin and La Mer are a league from the Chateau d'If. Dantes, nevertheless, determined to make for them. But how could he find his way in the darkness of the night? At this moment he saw the light of Planier, gleaming in front of him like a star. By leaving this light on the right, he kept the island of Teboulin a little on the left. By turning to the left, therefore, he would find it. But, as we have said, it was at least a league from the Chateau d'If to this island. Often in prison, Free had said to him, when he saw him idle and inactive, "Dantes, you must not give way to this listlessness. You will be drowned if you seek to escape, and your strength has not been properly exercised and prepared for exertion." These words rang in Dantes' ears, even beneath the waves. He hastened to cleave his way through them to see if he had not lost his strength. He found with pleasure that his captivity had taken away nothing of his power, and that he was still master of that element on whose bosom he had so often sported as a boy. Fear, that relentless pursuer, clogged Dantes' efforts. He listened for any sound that might be audible, and every time that he rose to the top of a wave he scanned the horizon and strove to penetrate the darkness. He fancied that every wave behind him was a pursuing boat, and he redoubled his exertions, increasing rapidly his distance from the chateau, but exhausting his strength. He swam on still, and already the terrible chateau had disappeared in the darkness. He could not see it, but he felt its presence. An hour passed, during which Dantes, excited by the feeling of freedom, continued to cleave the waves. "Let us see," said he. "I have swum above an hour, but as the wind is against me, that has retarded my speed. However, if I'm not mistaken, I must be close to Teboulin. But what if I were mistaken?" A shudder passed over him. He sought to tread water in order to rest himself, but the sea was too violent, and he felt that he could not make use of this means of recuperation. "Well," said he, "I will swim on until I am worn out, or the cramp seizes me, and then I shall sink." And he struck out with the energy of despair. Suddenly, the sky seemed to him to become still darker and more dense, and heavy clouds seemed to sweep down towards him. At the same time, he felt a sharp pain in his knee. He fancied for a moment that he had been shot, and listened for the report, but he heard nothing. Then he put out his hand, and encountered an obstacle, and with another stroke knew that he had gained the shore. Before him rose a grotesque mass of rocks that resembled nothing so much as a vast fire petrified at the moment of its most fervent combustion. It was the island of Teboulin. Dantes rose, advanced a few steps, and, with a fervent prayer of gratitude, stretched himself on the granite, which seemed to him softer than down. Then, in spite of the wind and rain, he fell into the deep, sweet sleep of utter exhaustion. At the expiration of an hour, Edmund was awakened by the roar of thunder. The tempest was let loose and beating the atmosphere with its mighty wings. From time to time, a flash of lightning stretched across the heavens like a fiery serpent, lighting up the clouds that rolled on in vast, chaotic waves. Dantes had not been deceived. He had reached the first of the 2 islands which, in fact, were Teboulin. He knew that it was barren and without shelter, but when the sea became more calm, he resolved to plunge into its waves again and swim to La Mer, equally arid but larger, and consequently better adapted for concealment. An overhanging rock offered him a temporary shelter, and scarcely had he availed himself of it when the tempest burst forth in all its fury. Edmund felt the trembling of the rock beneath which he lay. The waves, dashing themselves against it, wetted him with their spray. He was safely sheltered, and yet he felt dizzy in the midst of the warring of the elements and the dazzling brightness of the lightning. It seemed to him that the island trembled to its base, and that it would, like a vessel at anchor, break moorings and bear him off into the center of the storm. He then recollected that he had not eaten or drunk for 24 hours. He extended his hands and drank greedily of the rainwater that had lodged in a hollow of the rock. As he rose, a flash of lightning that seemed to rive the remotest heights of heaven illuminated the darkness. By its light, between the island of La Mer and Cape Corcel, a quarter of a league distant, Dante saw a fishing boat driven rapidly like a spectre before the power of winds and waves. A second after, he saw it again, approaching with frightful rapidity. Dantes cried at the top of his voice to warn them of the danger, but they saw it themselves. Another flash showed him 4 men clinging to the shattered mast and the rigging, while a 5th clung to the broken rudder. The man he beheld saw him undoubtedly, for their cries were carried to his ears by the wind. Above the splintered mast, a sail rent to tatters was waving. Suddenly, the rope that still held it gave way, and it disappeared in the darkness of the night like a vast sea bird. At that same moment, a violent crash was heard and cries of distress. Dantes, from his rocky perch, saw the shattered vessel, and among the fragments the floating forms of the hapless sailors. Then, all was dark again. Dantes ran down the rocks at the risk of being himself dashed to pieces. He listened, he groped about, but he heard and saw nothing. The cries had ceased, and the tempest continued to rage. By degrees, the wind abated. Vast gray clouds rolled towards the west, and the blue firmament appeared studded with bright stars. Soon, a red streak became visible in the horizon. The waves whitened, a light played over them, and gilded their foaming crests with gold. It was day. Dante stood mute and motionless before this majestic spectacle, as if he now beheld it for the first time. And indeed, since his captivity in the Chateau d'If, he had forgotten that such scenes were ever to be witnessed. He turned towards the fortress and looked at both sea and land. The gloomy building rose from the bosom of the ocean with imposing majesty and seemed to dominate the scene. It was about 5 o'clock. The sea continued to get calmer. In 2 or 3 hours, thought Dantes, the turnkey will enter my chamber, find the body of my poor friend, recognize it, seek for me in vain, and give the alarm. Then the tunnel will be discovered. The men who cast me into the sea and who must have heard the cry I uttered will be questioned. Then boats filled with armed soldiers will pursue the wretched fugitive. The cannon will warn everyone to refuse shelter to a man wandering about naked and famished. The police of Marseille will be on the alert by land, and the governor will pursue me by sea. I'm cold. I'm hungry. I've lost even the knife that saved me. My God, I've suffered enough, surely. Have pity on me, and do for me what I am unable to do for myself. As Dantes, his eyes turned in the direction of the Chateau d'If, uttered this prayer, he saw off the farther point of the island of Pomigu a small vessel with lateen sail skimming the sea like a gull in search of prey. And with his sailor's eye, he knew it to be a Genoese tartan. She was coming out of Marseille harbor and was standing out to sea rapidly, her sharp prow cleaving through the waves. "Oh," cried Edmund, "to think that in half an hour I could join her. Did I not fear being questioned, detected, and conveyed back to Marseille? What can I do? What story can I invent? Under pretext of trading along the coast, these men, who are in reality smugglers, will prefer selling me to doing a good action. I must wait, but I cannot. I'm starving. In a few hours my strength will be utterly exhausted. Besides, perhaps I have not been missed at the fortress. I can pass as one of the soldiers wrecked last night. My story will be accepted, for there's no one left to contradict me." As he spoke, Dantes looked towards the spot where the fishing vessel had been wrecked and started. The red cap of one of the sailors hung to a point of the rock, and some timbers that had formed part of the vessel's keel floated at the foot of the crag. In an instant, Dante's plan was formed. He swam to the cap, placed it on his head, seized one of the timbers, and struck out so as to cut across the course the vessel was taking. "I'm saved," murmured he, and this conviction restored his strength. He soon saw that the vessel, with the wind dead ahead, was tacking between the Chateau d'If and the Tower of Planier. For an instant, he feared lest, instead of keeping in shore, she would stand out to sea, but he soon saw that she would pass, like most vessels bound for Italy, between the islands of Giaros and Calasarane. However, the vessel and the swimmer insensibly neared one another, and in one of its tacks, the tartan bore down within 1/4 of a mile on him. He rose on the waves, making signs of distress, but no one on board saw him, and the vessel stood on another tack. Dantes would have shouted, but he knew that the wind would drown his voice. It was then he rejoiced at his precaution in taking the timber, for without it, he would have been unable, perhaps, to reach the vessel, certainly to return to shore should he be unsuccessful in attracting attention. Dantes, though almost sure as to what course the vessel would take, had yet watched it anxiously until it tacked and stood towards him. Then he advanced, but before they could meet, the vessel again changed her course. By a violent effort, he rose half out of the water, waving his cap, and uttering a loud shout peculiar to sailors. This time he was both seen and heard, and the tartan instantly steered towards him. At the same time, he saw they were about to lower the boat. An instant after, the boat, rowed by 2 men, advanced rapidly towards him. Dantes let go of the timber, which he now thought to be useless, and swam vigorously to meet them, but he had reckoned too much upon his strength, and then he realized how serviceable the timber had been to him. His arms became stiff, his legs lost their flexibility, and he was almost breathless. He shouted again. The 2 sailors redoubled their efforts, and one of them cried in Italian, "Courage!" The word reached his ear as a wave which he no longer had the strength to surmount passed over his head. He rose again to the surface, struggled with the last desperate effort of a drowning man, uttering a 3rd cry, and felt himself sinking, as if the fatal cannon shot were again tied to his feet. The water passed over his head, and the sky turned gray. A convulsive movement again brought him to the surface. He felt himself seized by the hair. Then he saw and heard nothing. He had fainted. When he opened his eyes, Dantes found himself on the deck of the tartan. His first care was to see what course they were taking. They were rapidly leaving the Chateau d'If behind. Dantes was so exhausted that the exclamation of joy he uttered was mistaken for a sigh. As we have said, he was lying on the deck. A sailor was rubbing his limbs with a woolen cloth. Another, whom he recognized as the one who had cried out, "Courage!" held a gourd full of rum to his mouth, while the third, an old sailor, at once the pilot and captain, looked on with that egotistical pity men feel for a misfortune that they have escaped yesterday, and which may overtake them tomorrow. A few drops of the rum restored suspended animation, while the friction of his limbs restored their elasticity. "Who are you?" said the pilot in bad French. "I am," replied Dantes in bad Italian, "a Maltese sailor. We were coming from Syracuse laden with grain. The storm of last night overtook us at Cape Morgue, and we were wrecked on these rocks." "Where do you come from?" "From these rocks that I had the good luck to cling to while our captain and the rest of the crew were all lost. I saw your vessel, and fearful of being left to perish on the desolate island, I swam off on a piece of wreckage to try and intercept your course. You've saved my life, and I thank you," continued Dantes. "I was lost when one of your sailors caught hold of my hair." "It was I," said a sailor of a frank and manly appearance, "and it was time for your sinking." "Yes," returned Dantes, holding out his hand. "I thank you again." "I almost hesitated, though," replied the sailor. "You looked more like a brigand than an honest man, with your beard 6 inches and your hair a foot long." Dantes recollected that his hair and beard had not been cut all the time that he was at Chateau d'If. "Yes," said he, "I made a vow to Our Lady of the Grotto not to cut my hair or beard for 10 years if I were saved in a moment of danger, but today the vow expires." "Now what do we do with you?" said the captain. "Anything you please. My captain is dead. I've barely escaped, but I am a good sailor. Leave me at the first port you make. I shall be sure to find employment." "Do you know the Mediterranean?" "I've sailed it over since my childhood." "You know the best harbors?" "There are a few ports that I could not enter or leave with a bandage over my eyes." "I say, Captain," said the sailor who had cried courage to Dantes, "if what he says is true, what hinders his staying with us?" "If he stays true," said the captain doubtingly. "But in his present condition, he will promise anything and take his chance of keeping it afterwards." "I will do more than I promise," said Dantes. "We shall see," returned the other, smiling. "Where are you going?" asked Dantes.
To Ligorn.
Then why, instead of tacking so frequently, do you not sail nearer the wind?
Because we should run straight on to the island of Rion.
You shall pass it by 20 fathoms.
Take the helm, and let us see what you know.
The young man took the helm, felt to see if the vessel answered the rudder promptly, and seeing that, without being a first-rate sailor, she was yet tolerably obedient. To the sheets, said he. The 4 seamen, who composed the crew, obeyed while the pilot looked on. Haul taut, they obeyed. Belay. This order was also executed, and the vessel passed, as Dantes had predicted, 20 fathoms to windward.
Bravo,
said the captain. Bravo, repeated the sailors, and they all looked with astonishment at this man whose eye now disclosed an intelligence and his body a vigor they had not thought him capable of showing. You see, said Dantes, quitting the helm, I shall be of some use to you, at least during the voyage. If you do not want me at Ligorn, you can leave me there, and I will pay you out of the wages I get for my food and the clothes you lend me.
Ah, said the captain, we can agree very well if you are reasonable.
Give me what you give the others, and it will be all right, answered Dantes.
That's not fair,
said the seaman who had saved Dantes, for you know more than we do.
What is that to you, Jacopo?
Answered the captain.
Everyone is free to ask what he pleases.
That's true, replied Jacopo.
I only make a remark. Well, you would do much better to find him a jacket and a pair of trousers if you have them.
No, said Jacopo, but I have a shirt and a pair of trousers. That's all I want, interrupted Dantes. Jacopo dived into the hold and soon returned with what Edmund wanted.
Now then, do you wish for anything else?
Said the patron. A piece of bread and another glass of that capital rum I tasted, for I have not eaten or drunk for a long time. He had not tasted food for 40 hours. A piece of bread was brought, and Jacopo offered him the gourd.
Larboard your helm,
cried the captain to the seaman. Dantes glanced that way as he lifted the gourd to his mouth, then paused with hand in midair.
Hello, what's the matter at the Chateau d'If?
Said the captain. A small white cloud, which had attracted Dantes' attention, crowned the summit of the bastion of the chateau. At the same moment, the faint report of a gun was heard. The sailors looked at one another.
What is this?
Asked the captain. A prisoner has escaped from the Chateau d'If, and they're firing the alarm gun, replied Dantes. The captain glanced at him, but he had lifted the rum to his lips and was drinking it with so much composure that suspicions, if the captain had any, died away. Pretty strong rum, said Dantes, wiping his brow with his sleeve.
At any rate, murmured the captain, if it be, so much the better, for I have made a rare acquisition.
Under pretense of being fatigued, Dantes asked to take the helm. The steersman, glad to be relieved, looked at the captain, and the latter, by a sign, indicated that he might abandon it to his new comrade. Dantes could thus keep his eyes on Marseille. What is the day of the month? Asked he of Jacopo, who sat down beside him.
The 28th of February.
In what year?
In what year?
You ask me in what year? Yes, replied the young man. I ask you in what year?
You have forgotten then?
I got such a fright last night, replied Dantes, smiling, that I have almost lost my memory. I ask you, what year is it?
The year 1829,
returned Jacopo. It was 14 years, day for day, since Dantes' arrest. He was 19 when he entered the Chateau d'If. He was 33 when he escaped. A sorrowful smile passed over his face. He asked himself what had become of Mercedes, who must believe him dead. Then his eyes lighted up with hatred as he thought of the 3 men who had caused him so long and wretched a captivity. He renewed against Danglars, Fernand, and Villefort the oath of implacable vengeance he had made in his dungeon. This oath was no longer a vain menace, for the fastest sailor in the Mediterranean would have been unable to overtake the little tartan that with every stitch of canvas set was flying before the wind to Ligorn. Chapter 22. The Smugglers. Dantes had not been a day on board before he had a very clear idea of the men with whom his lot had been cast. Without having been in the school of the Abbé Faria, the worthy master of La Jeune Amélie, the name of the Genoese tartan, knew a smattering of all the tongues spoken on the shores of that large lake called the Mediterranean, from Arabic to Provençal, and this, while it spared him interpreters, persons always troublesome and frequently indiscreet, gave him great facilities of communication, either with the vessels he met at sea, with the small boats sailing along the coast, or with the people without name, country, or occupation, who are always seen on the quays of seaports, and who live by hidden and mysterious means which we must suppose to be a direct gift of Providence, as they have no visible means of support. It is fair to assume that Dantes was on board a smuggler. At first, the captain had received Dantes on board with a certain degree of distrust. He was very well known to the customs officers of the coast, and as there was between these worthies and himself a perpetual battle of wits, he had at first thought that Dantes might be an emissary of those industrious guardians of rights and duties, who perhaps employed this ingenious means of learning some of the secrets of his trade. But the skillful manner in which Dantes had handled the lugger had entirely reassured him. And then, when he saw the light plume of smoke floating above the bastion of the chateau, and heard the distant report, he was instantly struck with the idea that he had on board his vessel one whose coming and going, like that of kings, was accompanied with salutes of artillery. This made him less uneasy, it must be owned, than if the newcomer had proved to be a customs officer. But this supposition also disappeared like the first, when he beheld the perfect tranquility of his recruit. Edmund thus had the advantage of knowing what the owner was, without the owner knowing who he was, and however the old sailor and his crew tried to pump him, they extracted nothing more from him. He gave accurate descriptions of Naples and Malta, which he knew as well as Marseille, and held stoutly to his first story. Thus the Genoese, subtle as he was duped by Edmund, in whose favor his mild demeanor, his nautical skill, and his admirable dissimulation pleaded. Moreover, it is possible that the Genoese was one of those shrewd persons who know nothing but what they should know, and believe nothing but what they should believe. In this state of mutual understanding, they reached Leghorn. Here, Edmund was to undergo another trial. He was to find out whether he could recognize himself, as he had not seen his own face for 14 years. He had preserved a tolerably good remembrance of what the youth had been, and was now to find out what the man had become. His comrades believed that his vow was fulfilled. As he had 20 times touched at Leghorn, he remembered a barber in St. Ferdinand Street. He went there to have his beard and hair cut. The barber gazed in amazement at this man with the long, thick, black hair and beard, which gave his head the appearance of one of Titian's portraits. At this period, it was not the fashion to wear so large a beard and hair so long. Now a barber would only be surprised if a man, gifted with such advantages, should consent voluntarily to deprive himself of them. The Leghorn barber said nothing and went to work. When the operation was concluded, and Edmund felt that his chin was completely smooth and his hair reduced to its usual length, he asked for a hand glass. He was now, as we have said, 33 years of age, and his 14 years' imprisonment had produced a great transformation in his appearance. Dantes had entered the chateau with the round, open, smiling face of a young and happy man, with whom the early paths of life have been smooth, and who anticipates a future corresponding with his past. This was now all changed. The oval face was lengthened. His smiling mouth had assumed the firm and marked lines which betoken resolution. His eyebrows were arched beneath a brow furrowed with thought. His eyes were full of melancholy, and from their depths occasionally sparkled gloomy fires of misanthropy and hatred. His complexion, so long kept from the sun, had now that pale color which produces, when the features are encircled with black hair, the aristocratic beauty of the man of the north. The profound learning he had acquired had besides diffused over his features a refined intellectual expression, and he had also acquired, being naturally of a goodly stature, that vigor which a frame possesses, which has so long concentrated all its force within itself. To the elegance of a nervous and slight form had succeeded the solidity of a rounded and muscular figure. As to his voice, prayers, sobs, and imprecations had changed it so that at times it was of a singularly penetrating sweetness, and at others rough and almost hoarse. Moreover, from being so long in twilight or darkness, his eyes had acquired the faculty of distinguishing objects in the night, common to the hyena and the wolf. Edmund smiled when he beheld himself. It was impossible that his best friend, if indeed he had any friend left, could recognize him. He could not recognize himself. The master of La Jeune Amélie, who was very desirous of retaining his crew, a man of Edmund's value, had offered to advance him funds out of his future profits, which Edmund had accepted. His next care, on leaving the barber's, who had achieved his first metamorphosis, was to enter a shop and buy a complete sailor's suit, a garb, as we all know, very simple, and consisting of white trousers, a striped shirt, and a cap. It was in this costume, and bringing back to Jacopo the shirt and trousers he had lent him, that Edmund reappeared before the captain of the lugger, who had made him tell his story over and over again before he could believe him. or recognize in the neat and trim sailor the man with thick and matted beard, hair tangled with seaweed, and body soaking in sea brine, whom he had picked up naked and nearly drowned. Attracted by his prepossessing appearance, he renewed his offers of an engagement to Dante's, but Dante's, who had his own projects, would not agree for a longer time than 3 months. La Jeune Amélie had a very active crew, very obedient to their captain, who lost as little time as possible. He had scarcely been a week at Leghorn before the hold of his vessel was filled with printed muslins, contraband cottons, English powder, and tobacco on which the excise had forgotten to put its mark. The master was to get all of this out of Leghorn free of duties, and land it on the shores of Corsica, where certain speculators undertook to forward the cargo to France. They sailed. Edmund was again cleaving the azure sea which had been the first horizon of his youth, and which he had so often dreamt of in prison. He left Gorgone on his right and La Pianosa on his left, and went towards the country of Paoli and Napoleon. The next morning on deck, as he always did at an early hour, the patron found Dantes leaning against the bulwarks, gazing with intense earnestness at a pile of granite rocks, which the rising sun tinged with rosy light. It was the island of Monte Cristo. La Jeune Amélie left it 3/4 of a league to the larboard, and kept on for Corsica. Dantes thought, as they passed so closely to the island whose name was so interesting to him, that he had only to leap into the sea, and in half an hour be at the promised land. But then what could he do without instruments to discover his treasure, without arms to defend himself? Besides, what would the sailors say? What would the patron think? He must wait. Fortunately, Dantes had learned how to wait. He had waited 14 years for his liberty, and now he was free. He could wait at least 6 months or a year for wealth. Would he not have accepted liberty without riches if it had been offered to him? Besides, were not these riches chimerical? Offspring of the brain of the poor Abbé Faria? Had they not died with him? It is true, the letter of the Cardinal Spada was singularly circumstantial, and Dantes repeated it to himself from one end to the other, for he had not forgotten a word. Evening came, and Edmund saw the island tinged with the shades of twilight, and then disappear in the darkness from all eyes but his own, for he, with vision accustomed to the gloom of a prison, continued to behold it last of all, for he remained alone upon deck. The next morn broke off the coast of Illyria. All day they coasted, and in the evening saw fires lighted on land. The position of these was no doubt a signal for landing, for a ship's lantern was hung up at the masthead instead of the streamer, and they came to within a gunshot of the shore. Dantes noticed that the captain of La Jeune Amélie had, as he neared the land, mounted 2 small culverins, which, without making much noise, can throw a 4-ounce ball 1,000 paces or so. But on this occasion the precaution was superfluous, and everything proceeded with the utmost smoothness and politeness. 4 shallops came off with very little noise alongside the lugger, which, no doubt, in acknowledgment of the compliment, lowered her own shallop into the sea, and the 5 boats worked so well that by 2 o'clock in the morning all the cargo was out of La Jeune Amélie and on terra firma. The same night, such a man of regularity was the patron of La Jeune, the profits were divided, and each man had 100 Tuscan livres, or about 80 francs. But the voyage was not ended. They turned the bowsprit towards Sardinia, where they intended to take in a cargo which was to replace what had been discharged. The second operation was as successful as the first. La Jeune was in luck. This new cargo was destined for the coast of the Duchy of Lucca, and consisted almost entirely of Havana cigars, sherry, and Malaga wines. There they had a bit of a skirmish in getting rid of the duties. The excise was, in truth, the everlasting enemy of the patron of La Jeune. A customs officer was laid low, and 2 sailors wounded. Dantes was one of the latter, a ball having touched him in the left shoulder. Dantes was almost glad of this affray, and almost pleased at being wounded, for they were rude lessons which taught him with what eye he could view danger, and with what endurance he could bear suffering. He had contemplated danger with a smile, and when wounded, had exclaimed with the great philosopher, "Pain, thou art not an evil." He had, moreover, looked upon the customs officer wounded to death, and whether from heat of blood produced by the encounter, or the chill of human sentiment, this sight had made but slight impression upon him. Dantes was on the way he desired to follow, and was moving towards the end he wished to achieve. His heart was in a fair way of petrifying in his bosom. Jacopo, seeing him fall, had believed him killed, and rushing towards him raised him up, and then attended to him with all the kindness of a devoted comrade. This world was not then so good as Dr. Pangloss believed it. Neither was it so wicked as Dante thought, since this man, who had nothing to expect from his comrade but the inheritance of his share of the prize money, manifested so much sorrow when he saw him fall. Fortunately, as we have said, Edmund was only wounded, and with certain herbs gathered at certain seasons and sold to the smugglers by the old Sardinian women, the wound soon closed. Edmund then resolved to try Jacopo, and offered him, in return for his attention, a share of his prize money, but Jacopo refused it indignantly. As a result of the sympathetic devotion which Jacopo had from the first bestowed on Edmund, the latter was moved to a certain degree of affection. But this sufficed for Jacopo, who instinctively felt that Edmund had a right to superiority of position, a superiority which Edmund had concealed from all others, and from this time the kindness which Edmund showed him was enough for the brave seaman. Then, in the long days on board ship, when the vessel, gliding on with security over the azure sea, required no care but the hand of the helmsman, thanks to the favorable winds that swelled her sails, Edmund, with a chart in his hand, became the instructor of Jacopo, as the poor Abbé Faria had been his tutor. He pointed out to him the bearings of the coast, explained to him the variations of the compass, and taught him to read in that vast book opened over our heads which they call heaven, and where God writes in azure with letters of diamonds. And when Jacopo inquired of him, "What is the use of teaching all these things to a poor sailor like me?" Edmund replied, "Who knows? You may one day be the captain of a vessel. Your fellow countryman, Bonaparte, became emperor." We had forgotten to say that Jacopo was a Corsican. 2 months and a half elapsed in these trips, and Edmund had become as skillful a coaster as he had been a hardy seaman. He had formed an acquaintance with all the smugglers on the coast, and learned all the Masonic signs by which these half-pirates recognize each other. He had passed and repassed his island of Monte Cristo 20 times, but not once had he found an opportunity of landing there. He then formed a resolution. As soon as his engagement with the patron of La Jeune Amélie ended, he would hire a small vessel on his own account, for in his several voyages he had amassed 100 piastres, and under some pretext land at the island. Then he would be free to make his researches, not perhaps entirely at liberty, for he would be doubtless watched by those who accompanied him. But in this world we must risk something. Prison had made Edmund prudent, and he was desirous of running no risk whatsoever. But in vain did he rack his imagination, fertile as it was, because he could not devise any plan for reaching the island without companionship. Dantes was tossed about on these doubts and wishes, when the patron, who had great confidence in him, and was very desirous of retaining him in his service, took him by the arm one evening and led him to a tavern on the Via dell'Oglio, where the leading smugglers of Ligorne used to congregate and discuss affairs connected with their trade. Already Dantes had visited this maritime bourse 2 or 3 times, and seeing all these hardy free traders, who supplied the whole coast for nearly 200 leagues in extent, he had asked himself what power might not that man attain who should give the impulse of his will to all these contrary and diverging minds. This time it was a great matter that was under discussion, connected with a vessel laden with Turkish carpets, stuffs of the Levant, and cashmeres. It was necessary to find some neutral ground on which an exchange could be made, and then to try and land these goods on the coast of France. If the venture was successful, the profit would be enormous, and there would be a gain of 50 or 60 piastres each for the crew. The patron of La Jeune Amélie proposed as a place of landing the island of Monte Cristo, which, being completely deserted, and having neither soldiers nor revenue officers, seemed to have been placed in the midst of the ocean since the time of the heathen Olympus by Mercury, the god of merchants and robbers, classes of mankind which we in modern times have separated, if not made distinct, but which antiquity appears to have included in the same category. At the mention of Monte Cristo, Dantes started with joy. He rose to conceal his emotion, and took a turn round the smoky tavern, where all the languages of the known world were jumbled in a lingua franca. When he again joined the 2 persons who had been discussing the matter, it had been decided that they should touch at Monte Cristo and set out on the following night. Edmund, being consulted, was of opinion that the island afforded every possible security, and that great enterprises to be well done should be done quickly. Nothing then was altered in the plan, and orders were given to get under way next night, and, wind and weather permitting, to make the neutral island by the following day. End of chapter 22.
And cut. That's a wrap, folks. Thanks for listening to today's episode of I've Been Meaning to Read That with me, your host, Dan. If you want to learn more about the show, you can follow us on Instagram at Meaning to Read and TikTok at I've Been Meaning. If you want to support the show to help keep it going, you can find me on Venmo at Dingus Donut, DINGUSDONUT. Supporters get a shout out on the show, and even more important, get to vote on the next book that we read. No matter what, I'll see you for our next episode. Until then, read those books you've been meaning to read, and have a lovely, lovely day.